Good morning. My name's Jim Lewis. Welcome to CSIS. Thanks for coming out in the morning. We are here to talk about incentives and how they affect cybersecurity. We've just put out a report sponsored by Intel on this and how the difference between, well, the original working title was Bureaucrats versus Pirates, but we thought that was a little too flashy. But how does, still tempting. But when I say that part of the cybersecurity environment is dynamic, innovative, and market-driven, unfortunately I'm talking about cybercrime. So we want to talk about how do you deal with opponents who are dynamic, how do you deal with opponents who are driven by price signals, very strong price signals. What can formal organizations do, both government agencies and companies, to compete with this very dynamic cybercrime market? So the focus here is incentives that drive one don't match up with the incentives that drive the other. We also found that the incentives within companies between what we were calling operators and the C-suite also don't line up, which creates a potential for vulnerability. We have two speakers today. The format will be they'll each deliver brief remarks, then we'll sit down, we'll do a little Q&A, and then we'll see if you have any questions. So just stand up or hold your hand up and please identify yourself when you have a question. Our speakers, Candace Worley, she's been here before at some great panels. She's a senior technology executive at Intel. She's had years of experience in developing enterprise software solution, senior vice president and general manager, for endpoint security, recently branded Intel Security, although we can talk about that later. We're really grateful to have her here because the last panel she did was great. So thank you for being here. The other speaker is Matt Lavinia, who is the CEO of the National Cyber Forensics and Training Alliance, which is located in Pittsburgh, which is where I was born, so I have a soft spot for it, right? Prior to joining NCFTA, he spent 26 years in the Secret Service working on a series of high-profile positions, including dealing with electronic crime. And Matt is a recognized leader in the cybersecurity law enforcement community. So we're grateful to have both these speakers. What I'd like to do now is ask them if they would come up, talk for a little bit about what they see the problems are, what they see the cybercrime environment, the corporate environment, then we'll go to the Q&A. Thank you, Candace.
All right,
please.
Great. Thank you so much, Jim. Thanks, folks. I'll probably be doing the whole thing because you get very fuzzy when I take them off, but my notes look really fuzzy when I don't have them on. So that's that. I'm going to call it years of experience as opposed to age thing. So thanks for coming out this morning. I know it's bright and early, but very much appreciate it. And hopefully the information that we'll share today will make the trip very worthwhile. I want to thank Jim for the kind words. It's always a pleasure to come out and speak at one of these events and to also work with he and Denise and the CSIS team on these reports. We've got a great partnership with them. It's not the first time or the last time. And so hopefully we'll have additional reports that bring value in terms of informing the market on cybersecurity in the future. As we looked at this new report, tilting the playing field and how misaligned incentives kind of work against cybersecurity, there were some interesting outcomes from this research. There's kind of an assumption that the good guys win, the bad guys lose. That's what we hope. And I think what we've found in this particular report is that there are some things that we're doing on the good guy side that are impeding our ability to successfully execute against cyber attacks. And if you kind of boil it down to just a few words, the few words are cyber criminals have the advantage right now. And the reason that they have the advantage is that there are kind of three key misalignments that we identified in this report. The first is really attackers versus defenders. They behave in different ways. The organizations and the structures that they leverage are very different, and they give advantages in one direction versus the others. The second is really strategy versus implementation. There's an assumption in organizations that the strategies that they have, assuming they have a strategy, are actually being implemented or fully implemented. And there's some erroneous assumptions being made on the part of executives as it relates to that particular misalignment. And the third is executives versus implementers. The people who are running organizations and setting the strategy, and the people who every day are sitting in front of a computer screen implementing and executing against those strategies. And so that's what we'll kind of focus on for just a few moments here. But before we do that, let's look back at just the priority that's been placed on cybersecurity and how that's changed. If we go back even just to the beginning of this decade, cybersecurity was definitely a topic, but it wasn't even one of the top 10 priorities for most organizations at an executive and board level. If we fast forward to today, somewhere in the neighborhood of 3/4 of companies are addressing the cybersecurity topic in their every single board meeting. So it has become a boardroom topic. And that's really because it's also become a liability topic, a topic associated with significant financial loss. And so that generally those are two areas that the board becomes very interested in what the organization's doing at that point. If we look at why the attacker versus defender scenario is a little bit out of balance, it's because attackers work in environments where there aren't a lot of rules. There isn't structure, there isn't bureaucracy. They don't need to ask permission or get approval to do anything. They are their own approvers. They work in a very fluid, non-structured environment. Now, juxtapose that to the typical large organization, where to implement a policy change, not only does it have to go through a change control process, if it's a material change, it's going to have to go to an executive level for approval. What that does is it slows down the process of making decisions. And if we think about how agile and quickly the cyber attackers move, if you compare that to trying to get a decision made in a large organization, you can see very clearly that the defenders are at a disadvantage compared to the attackers. If I have to go through an approval chain and it takes me 24 hours or even 2 hours to get that approval, compared to a hacker or an attacker who can do it with no approval very, very quickly, you can see where there's a significant difference there. If we kind of fast forward then to the impact of not making those decisions more quickly. Over the course of the last several years, companies have kind of paid a significant price. The estimate of the impact of cyber attacks in the last several years is around $400 billion when you take into consideration both organizations, public and private sector, as well as government organizations. Yet that's not chump change. That's a material amount of money. If you compare that, we did a study with CSIS a few years back on the economic impact of cybercrime. That's a fairly significant amount of impact. If you were to compare that to the gross domestic product of a number of nations, it is materially larger than most of them out there. So that's a lot of money for companies to be losing as a result of cybercrime. So now if we begin to think about strategy versus implementation, and we start to consider kind of what is the implication of strategy versus implementation? Well, most companies, when you talk to their executives, or when we talk to their executives, indicated that they believe they have a very solid cybersecurity strategy and that it is implemented. In fact, almost universally, there was a delta between what the executives thought and the implementers thought when it came to strategy versus implementation. Around 93% of executives and organizations indicated that they had a strategy and that it was fully implemented. However, the implementers in those same organizations had a bit of a different perspective. In fact, in the implementers, only 30% of them said that their strategy was fully implemented. That's a pretty significant delta. And it tells me that there's a gap in understanding between the executive ranks of organization and the people who are actually keeping the wheels on the bus every day. Now, if you think about that in the context of the threat landscape, that's a pretty good opportunity for the attackers. if you've got a delta of 90% expectation in executives that my strategy is implemented and 30% of the implementers say it's actually implemented, there's a pretty good delta there that gives hackers an opportunity to penetrate organizations. And then as we get to the kind of the last set of kind of misalignment, the incentives, where we've got executives versus implementers and their perspective of the incentives that are in place. In the hacker universe, or the black hat universe, the incentives are pretty basic. Notoriety and money. I mean, it boils down to cash. I do this and I make my decisions based on what will generate the most profit for myself and for my cybercrime ecosystem, because every cyber criminal today is part of a cybercrime ecosystem. It's no longer lone wolves out there hacking for fun. It's organized crime, it's nation state. It is a very, very organized and frankly, frighteningly organized set of cyber criminals that we're defending against today. So their incentives are cash and notoriety. In organizations, the incentives are typically, I get a paycheck, I get a bonus, my company rewards me publicly, gives me accolades for protecting the organization and doing a good job. But when we talk to executives versus implementers on whether or not the appropriate incentives are in place, almost universally, the executives felt that the incentives that were in place were very solid and were exactly what they needed in order to have people motivated to do the right thing for the organization and keep cybercrime to a minimum. However, when we talk to the implementers, a substantially smaller number of the implementers felt that the incentives were appropriate. For the most part, executives felt that pay and bonuses were the things that were most attractive to implementers. And some of this was country specific, by the way, so we'll put that caveat in there. The implementers thought pay was important, bonuses was important, but by the way, I just want to be recognized for the fact that, you know, I spend hours and hours of my life securing the company against cyber attacks. So as we kind of look at the outcome of this report and what it really brings to the forefront is organizations, I think, need to do a couple of things. One, they need to accelerate the decision-making process associated with cybercrime. If the primary reason that cyber criminals are winning the war against our defenders is because we can't make decisions fast enough in corporations, that sure seems like something we could fix. So I think organizations need to look at the approval process associated with cyber decision-making and put an accelerated process in place. The second thing that we have an opportunity to do is as we look at kind of the misalignment between we have a strategy and we've implemented the strategy, there should be a greater focus on closing the gap in understanding between the implementers and the executives. If there's some organizational, cultural, or other type of reason that is impeding the ability for those two to be closer together in their assumptions, that needs to get fixed. And I think the visibility at the board level may begin to actually change that. It's amazing when the board gets involved how excited executives get about paying attention to implementation. So I think we may see some movement in that. And then the third thing is around incentives. So if we've got implementers saying, I just want the company to give me better recognition, I love my bonus and my pay, not that I'm saying I want you to take that away, but I want recognition that what I do is important to the organization, it's meaningful, and it has impact. And executives think pay and bonuses are really all that's important. I think having executives teams understand that there is actually an intrinsic motivation in most cyber professionals that they do their job because they know it makes their organization safer, it makes the world a better place. And people who actually do their work for that reason, rewards and accolades are actually very important to them. And so I think aligning the incentive understanding between executives and implementers will be critical in organizations in terms to have a continued success in defeating cybercrime. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Candace. Matt. Yeah, I thought that the fact that the way people keep score is different even within the same organization was an interesting conclusion from this report.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Excellent. No, thank you very much. I apologize up front. I have a horrible cold, and so if I'm coughing and drinking water. I apologize here. But I want to say thank you for inviting me here to join you. I found the paper fascinating, yet to be quite honest, from my perspective, I was very happy to see the results, because that's kind of what we're seeing from the perspective where I sit. Where I sit, it's a very unique organization, and I'll give you the elevator pitch as to who we are. The NCFTA is a nonprofit organization in Pittsburgh, and we work with law enforcement or government and industry to provide a neutral environment for sharing information. And the information that's shared could be just common threat information. It could be results of something that actually happened to an organization, or it could be ongoing information sharing regarding a particular campaign to help industry mitigate their defenses. There's three things that we hope to achieve, and that's to identify what the problems are. So bringing industry together cross-sector to share information, which is a challenge in of itself. And to share that information, but to share it with law enforcement. And for law enforcement to share back. It still goes on today, but go back to the late 90s when they first started planning for this organization. The challenge was, well, industry would provide government with information and then would want to know, what else can you tell me about that? Here's the piece I have. I think it's important and you should know about it. And then government or law enforcement would say, well, thank you very much, and we'll go investigate this. And industries will tell us something about that. Well, we can't. It's law enforcement sensitive. We can't. It's classified. Well, what'd you do that for? You know, I was the one that gave it to you. That is a key problem with government industry information sharing when you're in the classified environment. And industry, I noticed it was reflected in the paper. Industry says they want more access to clearances, so that they can, get into the room with government, so that then government can share that information. That's not a panacea to fix the communication problem. Government is trying to do a good job, and I can say that from my prior life in government. So I do pick on government a lot. That government needs to do a better job. They claim to do a good job of sharing information. They want to share information with industry to help make industry stronger, but they need to do a better job. And what they're not hearing is, from industry's perspective, you need to tell us something that's actionable. Don't just tell us this is bad. Tell us something that we can implement to defend ourselves. What are we looking for? Yeah, we know ransomware is bad. Okay, what can we do about it? The downside is not much, other than backing up and cyber hygiene. But if you're telling us things, so if the government's telling industry things, you need to make sure that it's actionable for industry. In the environment that I live in. And I've lived in, for a long time, even when I was with the Secret Service. Partnering with industry is important. So from the government's perspective, it's very important. The government, contrary to popular belief, the government does not know everything. Industry knows an awful lot more than the government does. Industry sees it every day, all day. The challenge is, industry, their mandates, so that you talked about the operators. The operators within industry are mandated, protect this house, right? Block everything, protect this house. How are we going to measure that? Have we been breached? That's how we measure that. So if you did that, you did your job, and congratulations, and you'll get a bonus, or you'll get paid, and you'll keep your job. If they get in, then we have something to talk about. The problem is if everyone does that, and everyone says, nope, we're good, we blocked, then why are the criminals making tens of billions of dollars a year? So somebody's losing. The ones that are losing are the victims where the criminals have gone. So they come knocking at your door and you block them. You're sophisticated enough and you could see them at the door and you say, no, don't come in here. You're gonna chase them to your neighbor. You're not gonna tell your neighbor that they're coming. So now they go to your neighbor. They learned from you because you blocked them, so they're not gonna try that trick again. So they're gonna try a different trick and they're gonna get into your neighbor. Then they're gonna steal from your neighbor. So then they're gonna get smarter and they're gonna get richer and they're still coming back to you after they learned some new tricks. So you're just gonna have this circle of mitigation, and mitigation should not be the end state. The end state should be mitigate and then let's disrupt them. Stop them from making so much money. The incentives and measurements, we did an informal study, and this would be something for the future. Each company has, I guess, a different terminology, but say an acceptable loss amount, right? Here's how much we can afford to lose, say from fraud or from cyber, but there's an amount. What that amount is. We did an informal study, and it's scary how much we allow them to make. We're funding the cyber criminal enterprise because we have an allowable loss amount. If you add that all together, it equals billions and billions and tens of billions of dollars. And we're okay with that. If you want to incentivize, it was interesting, I wrote that down. One of the, some folks in the survey, was a little more than 10%, I couldn't tell on the chart, responded that they have not seen any cybersecurity breaches. Really? And then there were some that said even though they hadn't lost any revenue. Well, I'd argue that's probably an accounting practice, that you haven't lost any revenue because you factored in an acceptable loss, and as long as you didn't exceed that acceptable loss, your revenue's good. So everybody's happy. Let's lower that acceptable loss and then see what happens. But if you lower that acceptable loss, now maybe your C-suite is talking to your operators and a little closer to say, hey, now we're really measuring. We're not okay with this amount of loss, and let's see how you're doing now. Because the operators that I've talked to, they know what that number is. And they know that as long as they keep things below that number, they get their bonus. So let's say you're a extremely large company and your number is $500 million. And that's an example. So there's a company and their acceptable loss, as long as all their losses don't exceed $500 million, everybody gets their bonus. Holy cow. So if we're at 450 million and it's December 20th, I think we're good. We're getting our bonus. Awesome. I don't think that's awesome. I don't think losing $450 million is awesome. And I don't think funding criminals $450 million is awesome. Because that's where it's going. It's not shrinkage. This is funding criminals. And it just makes them stronger and makes them smarter and makes them richer. So for me personally, that's my problem with that. And I'm just going to leave it at that because I can get on the stump all day. But I'll leave it at that, and I think I'm really looking forward to this panel, and I really appreciate the report. I think every CISO and everybody in the C-suite should read it because it gives them a perspective that if they have the blinders on, they should read it and know what the other side, the operators, and vice versa, they should see what each other's thinking. Because if they haven't opened that you know, the open door policy, right? And they haven't talked to each other, but they should see that. It's true from the folks I've talked to. It is accurate. It's spot on. And I think it'll help. There's also another HR study, I think, in there with some of the executives in our generation of workers, but that's for another day. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt. I thought one of the interesting things so what we did in this report is we surveyed around the world about 800 different executives. And one of the things that I wasn't expecting was that for a lot of them, especially as you went up higher, cybercrime is just, they've now accommodated, as Matt was saying, it's the cost of doing business. So one of the questions I thought about with that, and in listening to both of you, is can we manage this as we manage other corporate risks? I mean, what's the right risk management strategy? Is it just saying we should accept 500 million in losses, or should we be doing something different? Because that was one of the problems that drove a lot of the discontent, is that there was a sense that the goal was not perfection, the goal was manageable risk. And we all say that, but is that the right approach?
Not necessarily from my perspective. And I think that if, I think one of the things, lower that, but then as a measurement or to figure out if we're actually having an impact, it would be, you know, attribution, who's doing it. So can we get to attribution, and can we get to, were they arrested, were they identified? You know, there are some landmark cases out of the Western District of Pennsylvania where, you know, the Chinese Army actors were indicted. They'll never be arrested. They'll never appear in court in Pittsburgh, but they were outed and their faces are on a wanted poster. And it took the guts of the companies there to step forward and say, yeah, this happened to us. It did, but you know, we're going to do something about it. So I think I'd like to see companies stand up and say, we're going to do something about it. I hope that it's not that it hasn't been painful enough yet, because it's been pretty painful. But sometimes that's what it takes. It takes a you know, a catastrophe almost to happen before everyone will kind of change their mindset.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there'll always be a measure of manageable risk. It's not the optimal state, nor would I ever assert that it's the optimal state, but I think it's the realist state. And the reason I say that is because if we figured out everything that the black hats were doing today and we put a fix in place for it, we'd still get hacked tomorrow. Mm-hmm. Because they would simply change their path. They would change their behavior. They would create a new exploit. They would modify an existing toolkit, which is exactly all the behaviors that they use today. As soon as we figure out how to block them, they modify and evolve. They are, frankly, amazing in their ability to respond so quickly and so creatively. And so I think, despite the fact that it's unpalatable, some level of managed risk will always be a reality for governments and corporations.
On that note, would both of you be able to talk? Would both of you be able to talk a little bit about what are the trends we might want to watch in cybercrime? Where is it evolving? You mentioned that it's gone from. So we all know 20 years ago, it was not amateurish, but a lot of amateurs in the business, and you know, many people in the room probably remember the phrase "script kiddies." Well, it's not script kiddies anymore. So what are the trends we want to look at when we think about cybercrime?
So the one that comes to mind for me most is I think that as organizations begin to move more and more of their workload to the cloud, I think the cloud becomes a very interesting target. Mm-hmm. I mean, certainly I think that, you know, there's some attacks in the cloud now, but a lot of corporations have kind of held the crown jewels back within the corporate boundary. Mm-hmm. And we're seeing a lot of companies now embrace more readily moving critical workloads into cloud infrastructure. And so for me, I think one of the areas that we're going to see more targeted attacks is kind of cloud applications and the infrastructure and platforms associated with cloud. Because I think if they can figure out how to hop from one part of a cloud to another part of a cloud, it becomes a great way to get a lot with one hit. So.
I see one of the keys to a lot of this, from my perspective, is authentication and credentials. That is where we see the criminals focusing on, because the credentials and the front door access is what leads to most of the breaches. Most of the exfiltration of data comes from somebody who got in the front door based on compromised credentials. You go compromised credentials, it is very low tech. It is a phish. You send a phishing email, you're going to compromise those credentials. There is a massive marketplace for the exchange and collection and testing and validating of compromised credentials. Add that to the criminal infrastructure that they have to support with the botnets. It's a massive threat. But that's, from what we see, aside from, say, your nation state threat actor, the next level would be focusing on credential harvesting.
I think there's one other area, which, and I think the Dyn attack recently brought this to the fore. And Internet of Things, so it's been the hottest topic that everybody wanted to talk about for, gosh, how many years now? And the issue was that it was like, okay, it was the big scary monster under the bed, but it hadn't really crawled out from underneath the bed yet. And I think we saw it crawl out from underneath the bed with that attack, right? I think it was indicative of what we may see in the future as these devices become more and more pervasive, not only within corporations and within government infrastructure, but also within the consumer space. And I think that if we look at the level of consumption in the consumer world of devices that are connected to the internet, and we think about how employees are working from home more and more, whether it's in the evening or during the day as their primary location for work, the worlds of home computing and corporate computing are becoming more inextricably tied. And as more and more of these internet-connected devices become a part of that network, those attacks become increasingly more attractive. And so I just think that that's another area where it's easy to overlook, the device that's sitting on the table in the living room at home, or your Nest camera, or whatever. But it gives incredible access to individuals and organizations in ways that we haven't seen before. And I think that those are going to be avenues that are leveraged fully by attackers going forward.
When you were talking about the cloud, I was thinking most of the big cloud companies are pretty good at security.
They are.
So you would think then if you're a criminals are going to go where there's value. If value moves to the cloud, which it has, that's where they're going to go. But what will their target be? Going after, say, one of the big cloud providers could be hard. Who are they going to go after?
It could. So I think that as we look at the potential, it's probably apps, right? So if we look at where most of the exploits and attacks happen, it's vulnerabilities in applications or operating systems. And those are usually a door that gets them into the organization. Cloud applications are likely to be the same. So my suspicion is that they will begin to look at what are the vulnerabilities in the applications that give me access to that cloud, and how can I gain access to the data in that cloud. You also have just the data as it traverses from a person's device or an organization's network to the cloud. Anytime that data in transit, and let's face it, what people want is data, whether that's personal information, whether that's intellectual property. The data is the jewels that they're after in the cyber world. And any place that data is in transit is a potential opportunity to pick it off.
So it might be a little different profile than from the crime we're used to.
It could be. I just never underestimate that adversary, because whenever the industry of security or the industry of just business in general evolves their defenses, the attackers evolve their attack methods. And so I fully expect that.
Finally getting it, but it's to your point with the data at rest and the data at transit, that's where the focus is going to be. So if I can't get to the cloud, I'm going to get to some point in between, and that's where I'm going to grab the data. So that's an excellent point.
Where do you think companies should be spending their money now when it comes to cybersecurity? And where, looking ahead a couple of years, where should they be spending?
You do realize you're asking security companies.
I do, and I was going to put that caveat in, but I thought that's too many words. So, as a neutral observer.
A neutral observer. So I think to your point earlier, identity and authentication, strengthening the identity and access controls in corporations. Because if you can block people from getting in the first place, block them from getting access in the first place, that is always the best place to start. Now, in reality, there will be someone in your organization that clicks on the picture of cute bunnies. They can't help themselves, right? Or, the link to the, oh my goodness, this is the funniest YouTube video I have ever seen. You have to click here. They will do it. And the attackers are in. So once they're in, I think fundamentally you have to secure where the data is. And if we look at where that is, I think mostly going forward, I think it's going to be endpoints and clouds, right? I think, the endpoint has sort of been the last point of defense for a long time. And when it's not on a network and it's not attached to a cloud, you're relying on the same end user that clicked on the cute bunny picture to secure the endpoint. So make sure you have appropriate protections on that endpoint. Everything from encryption to advanced security capabilities around, behavioral. And frankly, I mean, not that I think AV is the defense people should count on anymore, but it catches a whole lot of garden variety stuff that prevents the folks in your security organization from having to spend time on it. It means they can focus on the more advanced attacks and implementing more advanced security capabilities. So I think that's important. I think in the cloud, you've got to look at data protection. You've got to gain visibility. A lot of the challenges I hear from corporations right now as they make this transition to cloud is they feel like they lose visibility of their data, lose visibility of their security controls. And so looking at technologies like orchestration, like management controls that allow you to gain inroads there. And I think there are a lot of companies out there that have recognized that same opportunity.
Hey, Matt, if you were going to talk about where you think companies should be spending as we move forward, what would you recommend?
Excuse me. I think training is critical, and I still believe in people. So you can invest in software. You can invest in hardware. You can constantly upgrade. You can buy more tools. It's funny. I met somebody from a company, and he said. We had a lot. Our CISO just got a big budget last year, so we're good to go. But I don't know what he bought. There's a whole room of equipment that I don't even. There's so much equipment in there because he got this big budget and he bought everything. So everybody knocked on the door and brought them all these great tools and bells and whistles, and he bought it all. So it's in this room, but he didn't tell the installers and the operators what he bought. So they had no idea what was coming. It's just in this room. And they calculated, we don't have enough time this year to install all this. So by the time we install it, it might even be obsolete. We don't even know where all this is going to go. So you have to upgrade. I get that. But don't ignore the people. Don't let the machines and the software and technology take the place of all the people. You still need people to interpret what's going on. The machines can do a great job up to a point, and then you need people. It's like, okay, we did all this. now look at it.
Yeah, there's something about gray matter that makes a difference, especially when you get to incident response.
Yep.
And the ability to really be able to track and understand what an advanced attack did. I think he actually touched on something that, if I may. Buying a bunch of stuff and putting it in a room is not a good answer, right? Even if it's our stuff, it's not a good answer if it's just sitting in a room somewhere. Because security technology that's not actually connected to anything doesn't secure you very well. Now, even sometimes when it is implemented, it doesn't secure you very well. And here's why. Because isolated sets of technologies that are unaware that there's anything else in the organization from a countermeasure perspective blocks one avenue but leaves really big dark spaces in between the security countermeasures. So having a security infrastructure that is integrated at an intelligence sharing level, at a policy level, is critically important to gaining that security. We can look at some of the big breaches that have occurred over the last couple of years. There was no shortage of security budget in those organizations. And in fact, in fairness to those organizations, there was no shortage of implementation of those technologies. But what happened is someone found the dark space between the technologies, and that's how they penetrated the organization. So creating architectures that are integrated, that are countermeasure aware from a security perspective is absolutely critical to having kind of a comprehensive and very effective security posture.
You said one of my favorite words, which is architecture, because I think a lot of times, and we're kind of going through this here now, that you can have very nice pieces, but if you don't have the architecture that connects them, you're still very vulnerable.
Well, and you put incredible pressure on the people in your team, right?
Yeah.
So when the countermeasures are not aware of each other, when they're not sharing the intelligence, so like if someone attacks you at the network edge and you don't have enough bodies to recognize that and change the policy at the endpoint, well, okay, I took a shot at the network and I got shot down, but endpoint's wide open. I'll just go through the back door instead of the front door, right? So having the ability to learn something from the attack that happened at the network and have it auto-populate throughout the environment so that every other countermeasure in the environment becomes aware of that attack and knows to block it, I think is the only way we've got a shot at actually creating an architecture and a security environment that actually can win against some of these attacks.
One of the things that you both raised was the changes in the C-suite. And certainly we've all seen that 10 years ago, cybersecurity was not a primetime issue. Now it's kind of hard to escape, but one of the things we found in the survey is it's still, C-suites know about it, they talk about it, boards know about it and talk about it, but somehow it doesn't quite connect with what they're doing in their companies. That was more frequent than we might thought. If you were going to think about where we are in the corporate world, and you touched on this, where would you say we are now? How do boards think? How do companies think about this? How has it changed in the last few years?
From the folks I've talked to, it absolutely has changed. And if I'm talking to the CSO or the CISO, their morale is actually up because they're being invited into the room, or on a weekly or monthly basis, they're having a meeting with the CEO, or they're meeting with the board, or the CEO is asking them to step into the board meeting and tell us where we're at. So that's very good for them. I think for their morale, it's good for the organization that they're focusing on it. I can't say that whether it's the CEO or the board understands it all, but they're asking the questions, which is great. And I don't want to say it's a start because it's already been happening. So it has been happening, and to me that's good.
I'm also seeing with some of the customers we talk to a change in reporting structure. So we do a security executive council twice a year with somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 large corporations where the CISOs join us and kind of talk trends and strategy and that kind of stuff. And what's been interesting to me is several of these folks have had their reporting structure changed. They're no longer reporting to a CIO. They're actually reporting directly into the CEO, or they're reporting directly into the Office of Risk Management. And so I think that it's an acknowledgement that we need to get the cyber function closer to kind of those folks who are making those risk trade-offs, right? So if I'm a CEO or a board of directors and somebody comes in and says, yeah, we got this under control, the strategy's implemented, yeah, we're going to incur some losses, but then they found out that, only 30% of the time the strategy actually got implemented, there might be a very different discussion at the board meeting with the CIO and the CISO, right? So I think that we're finding a few organizations are elevating the stature of the cybersecurity executive so that they're getting a direct line report into CEO and board, which I thought was an interesting thing to have happened.
But what you used to hear is that, well, you guys are a cost center, you're not a profit center, so therefore that puts you in sort of a second-class position. Do you still see that sort of distinction?
Well, so I don't think anybody sees it as a profit center, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's no doubt that an IT and security organization, there is a cost. I think there's an acknowledgement that it is a cost of doing business that is not only unavoidable, but absolutely critical to the sustainability of the organization. I mean, there are probably, some people could argue some costs you could live without. I don't think there's anybody naive enough at this point to think that cybersecurity protection is one of those.
Yeah, no, I agree. It is a cost center, but it's a cost center you can't live without. So part of the report talked about brand and reputation. Most companies can afford the economic loss of a breach, whether it's the $4 million average or whatever it costs for a breach, or it's the loss of intellectual property or the loss of just funds through business email compromise, for example. Most of them can absorb that economic loss. They can't recover from reputation harm and harm to the brand. That is number one. And nowadays, yeah, a cyber issue, my privacy is violated because my customer data that I entrusted you with is now out there. That makes me mad, and now I don't like you, and now I don't like your brand, and I'm not coming back. You could do whatever you want, but I'm not coming back. Now, I get that companies are victims, so I'm not saying it's something that was negligent, but you really got to put your tap shoes on to do the dance to get around and salvage your reputation. So it does have a significant impact in the bottom line. It's just not direct.
Go ahead.
I found it interesting that in the report it said that some of the companies didn't think that their profits had been impacted by cybersecurity, and I had to read it like 3 times because I couldn't believe that they would actually say that. They said, oh, well, the production line went down for a little bit, or, we had a bunch of users who couldn't use their laptop for a little bit. Well, yeah, I was a general manager at McAfee for 5 years, and believe me, if I had, 25 development engineers down for 3 days because systems were out, I can equate that to profit. Product took longer to get to market, less time in market to sell product, competitors got there before me. I mean, there are all kinds of implications of any kind of impact to the productivity of your workforce that translate directly into profit. And so I think that perhaps the folks who felt that way hadn't, done the math on what was the impact of my production line being down for 6 hours.
Yeah, that was a funny one. We had some funny, bumpy parts in the survey that, in retrospect, we might have changed the question a little bit or asked a follow-up question. So, but that was one of the interesting things for me is that most companies now see this as one of their top 3 risks. Yeah. That's a big change. Absolutely. And the risk, as Matt was saying, the primary thing they're worried about is reputational risk. That's where they fear damage the most. So that is a different environment. Let me see if there's questions in the audience. I have more questions, but we had a couple people. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Alejandro de la Fuente. I'm a AAA fellow at CSIS. I have a culture regarding
We have a microphone.
Sorry.
So far, all the people on the web just see the back of your head. And
Okay.
Well, it's a very nice back. It's just,
I have 2 questions, and they're really short. What can industries do to establish a culture where you have more responsible users, because if you encourage users to, patch continuously or upgrade their systems, then you basically reduce the amount of attacks that those companies will have. And second is how much industries invest in basic research, because I think progress in basic research in terms of computing and encryption, and it's slow, especially now that we're trying to move into quantum computing, for example. Government is doing some, but I think it's a slow progress. And this is slow because any little bit of progress is just really slow because of you're dealing with quantum systems and so on and so forth. So, okay, thank you.
So you mentioned users. I'll very quickly comment because I think you'll be able to speak a lot to the user part. Without question, educating your users to, my inside voice says not to be stupid. My outside voice says to be more informed about their decisions, right? Is absolutely critical. I mean, we're part of Intel Corporation today as Intel Security Group, and they run tests on us. So you get the email, that the cute bunny picture or whatever it is, right? And they see who clicks on it, and then all of those people get to go to training. They get an opportunity for coaching at that point, right? And I think that it's absolutely critical because a lot of those folks are incredibly brilliant individuals. These are not uneducated people. These are not people who don't understand the computing world. And I've seen it at other companies that I worked for in the past where somebody just clicks because they don't think. And so I think a continued educational program and running kind of those tests for your employees to remind them, hey, phishing is very real, and sometimes it's really difficult to identify what's a phish is critically important. And then I think the other area where I think corporations have got to focus is they've got to patch vulnerabilities more quickly. I think in the report, it was an average of 42 days or something like that. The report has a statistic in here on how long it took after a vulnerability was announced for a company on average to patch it. Mm-hmm. Well,
and that's the median. That's half of them took more. Yeah.
Every day it's not patched is a really great day for the attacker. Right?
Because they get the same alert.
Exactly.
When the patch comes out and says you should patch this, they get the same alert.
Yeah, guaranteed. They're on those distribution lists, right? So I think continuing to educate very proactively the end user, the person that sets it at the systems, but also accelerate the patching of the vulnerabilities as you get those announcements, because the attackers are all over those. So.
That's Ian Gottesman in the back, who's our CIO here, and I love the tests we do here. It's a think tank, so we don't send fuzzy bunnies. We send invitations to the British Embassy for a reception, or the last one that worked pretty well was a note from our CEO with a PDF analyzing the new administration. And it's like, oh my God, that's like so many flashing red lights, yet you still got people that click on it, so.
Yeah, fuzzy bunnies is not really what they send out, by the way. I was using that.
We should try fuzzy bunnies here. I bet it would work, Matt.
I completely agree. Your weakest link are your employees and your third parties, your say your vendors. One of my claim to fames is back in the day when the Target breach and the AC vendor, the air conditioning and HVAC vendor that was the source from law enforcement, or if you're in the military, or your weapon's not dangerous, it's your trigger finger, and so the weapon can't go off unless you pull the trigger. The weapon can't go off unless you click that mouse, and so they could be sending you those phishing emails, and they are rampant. They are everywhere. Go to the Internet of Things. We've built their botnet for them. So they have their botnet built through the Internet of Things to send us the phish to grab, to collect what they want. So it's there for them to use. They're going to use it. They're going to exploit it. Training, and testing constantly. It's still not going to fix it, but it is important. The individual is our weakest link.
And then we didn't answer your second
complexity,
question. So,
He said quantum computing, so
yeah.
it's all yours.
yeah, that might actually be a little over my technical level as well. But I think there's not enough research. I mean, so if you're just asking for our opinion on whether or not there's enough research going on in terms of, taking encryption to the next level, taking security technologies to the next level, certainly there is a material incentive on the part of security vendors to do some level of research on where we need to go next with product, because if we don't go there and someone else does, that puts us at a disadvantage in the market. The challenge, I think, is always that corporations are profit centers, right? And so if there's not a direct line of sight between the research and profit, it becomes difficult to justify the investment. And that's universal, whether that's a security vendor or somebody in a manufacturing environment, whatever, that will always be the case. And so I think that there will be a continued need for research and development through government, through universities, that keep that pipeline of new tech alive and new.
To Congress, so something to work on. We had a couple other questions. Oh, we had a bunch of questions. I'm sorry. Why don't we do 1, 2, 3, 4? Go ahead.
Thank you. So I'm Robert Wood from a healthcare company called Nuna out in San Francisco, your neck of the woods.
Yes.
So my question is, piggybacking off of this gentleman's, have you guys had any success, and I ask because I've seen it work very well in smaller companies, about distributing or reframing the narrative around incentives and why people should do things? So, instead of saying, like, we keep training people, people keep falling for social engineering attacks. So, like, we should ask ourselves, is training really effective versus incentivizing people, through little, like, micro bonuses or internal bug bounty programs, things like that, to actively report phishing campaigns or actively report bugs, vulnerabilities, et cetera. And then on the flip side, or extending that to patching, reframing the narrative around, well, you have to patch your systems because security is telling you to do something, versus why don't we make our systems more resilient and responsive and maintainable, which are things that system owners are going to be more interested in, versus needing to apply a bunch of patches because security is telling them to do things. So I'd be curious to get your guys' thoughts on whether you've seen that kind of reframing or that kind of distribution of bonus and incentive to work at a larger enterprise scale.
I've seen that example, yeah, and it works, where they're rewarded instead of being, you still have the penalty box that you're going to go in if you fail the test, but I've seen it work where, yeah, you're being rewarded for reporting. So whether it was during the test or not, something that might have gotten through, and they have that forward box to the security team, and I don't know what this is, but can you look at this? And they get a winner, and they announce it, and so you be public about it is important. So just like a reward, or just like incentivizing somebody to do their job, or a recognition award, recognition is important. So if people see they're getting recognized for doing the good job, and I think culturally within an organization, if they understand that they're part of the security, that everybody is part of the security, that I'm helping protect the company is paying me to do my job, that's why I have my job here, and so I'm part of that security fabric, that's always good.
We have a cheeky little trophy that we hand out to the people we call the Human Firewall Award.
There you go.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, it is.
Great idea.
Yep.
I usually prefer an Old Testament approach where thunder and lightning visits them, but that's probably not the right approach, and it's too old school. We got another question.
Hi, Jory Tremblay. I'm a consultant investor in the space. Risk-reward question. One is around fraud, which you talked about. If you can keep them out, it's the best strategy, both analogies. There's two-factor authentication has been around for a while. There's multi-factor, there's behavioral. A lot of that data creates a different endpoint on the device. What's your thought about why people aren't adopting that faster, and how much of that do you think is friction? And then the second is, we understand a lot of what these strategies are. How come we're not catching people? Is it because people don't want to come forward and say they've been hacked? You know, because you got to protect the castle, and then you got to go get the bad guys, right?
Right.
So two different
There's
ends of
a
the.
severe underreporting, so it's just safer. Inside counsel will say, nah, we'll handle this ourselves, call the insurance company, and let's keep this within our walls, right? Yes, absolutely that happens. That's a problem. I try constantly to talk to companies to try and break down that wall. It's just, to them, it's just safer not to say anything. What that causes is, so you talk about helping the government, or if you want the government to help you, you got to tell them things. So if they don't know these things are going on, like today, then they can't help you. So that underreporting is a problem. What was your first one?
First one was about fraud, two-factor authentication.
Yeah. I may be wrong. My perspective is it's customer service. So if somebody's website or their app or whatever it is easy to get into, then it's easy to get into, and I'm going to use it. And if I have to jump through hoops, eventually people are going to get it. That, oh, wait a minute, they're taking the time. I mean, your banks do it, right? They have multi-factor and everything, so it's there. But some other sites that are extremely weak, that don't have anything at all, you got to really start questioning, like, do I want to have an account here and things like that. But most people, oh, this is easy, I'm in. So there's no pushback. I envision a day where a company, say it's a retailer, because they want people to get in and out fast on the web, that no, it's going to take you another step to get into our site, but we're locked down. I mean, you should be able to trust us, give us your information, shop here, bank here, whatever. Because we do, we take your privacy, we take our security seriously, and there are extra steps. Sorry, but it's safer.
Yeah.
I think it might be a business decision, somebody, not creating that long line of customers.
Yeah, I agree. I think the two-factor authentication is the convenience factor. End users often talk about security being important to them until it takes them 30 seconds longer to do something that they used to be able to do in 2. and so it's unfortunate, but I think that's the reality of where they're at, and companies will often do what it takes to get them happy customers. And if 2 seconds is better than 32 seconds, even if it's a heck of a lot less secure, some organizations will make that trade-off. I think to the comment around why do we not catch more? I think there's a couple of dynamics at play there. One is companies don't want to, like, if I admit that I got hacked, then will the market question whether or not they should do business with me, right? And so I think there will always be reticence to be completely transparent, because even if there was no immediate loss, I didn't lose PII, I didn't lose your credit card information, I didn't lose your healthcare records, whatever that might be. Well, you got hacked, though, so maybe next time you will. Mm-hmm. So I think there's always a little bit of concern there. I think the second part of it is, even if the company had the capacity and it was legal to track down who hacked them, I question whether or not we have enough capacity in law enforcement to be able to follow every single hacking lead. Because if we look at the number of incidents, I think we're seeing, 500,000 new pieces of malware a day. Now, some of those are variants, right? So they're polymorphics that just change on the fly. But if law enforcement actually got a lead for every one of them that said, it was Bob. Bob drives a Pinto and lives in, Anaheim. Law enforcement would never have the capacity.
Isn't that punishment enough?
I was trying to pick something very innocuous. We wouldn't have enough capacity in the system to track them all down. And so, not that I am advocating in any way that we should not track them down. We absolutely should, where we have the information and the wherewithal to do that. But I worry that we simply don't have the capacity in the system. So it's going to have to be a combination of companies and law enforcement and government that begin to take that problem on.
And one of the things that I think came out of the report is that not only do we not have enough resources, now it will be difficult to ever put enough resources in against the scope of the problem that exists. And so we got to think of ways to shrink the pool of applicants for the dark side.
Well, I think what the Black Hats are brilliant at is scalability. Like, let's face it, they write one bloody toolkit. They put it out there, and it gets turned into hundreds, of, not thousands of pieces of malware by other people on their behalf. I mean, they've become brilliant at scale, at having a single piece of code adapt and be scaled. And I think, what we're trying to do on the defender side is we've got to look at how do we make the defenses equally adaptable and scalable. And I think that's one of the things that we can learn from the other side is, they're very adept at doing that. And how do we flip that bit and be equally scalable and adaptable from a security infrastructure perspective?
We had, I think, we're getting a lot of questions at the end, but why don't you start at the back and work your way forward? So.
Thank you. Survey that could be brought into that this discussion about cyber attacks on democracy. Thank you.
So let me see if I got this. Let me mirror that back. So the question is, as we look at the outcome of the survey and the implications of the 3 misalignments, how might those relate to kind of the discussions that we've been having around cyber implications for free elections? Free elections, whether it's an attack on a particular company because they're an oil production company or they test cosmetics on animals or hacktivism or pick your poison. Having your environment be the least penetrable possible is critically important in deterring the hacks. And I think the free elections question is just yet the next step, right? We've seen various companies be attacked because there are constituents within the US and other countries that disagree with the way they do business, that disagree with what they're in the business of. And I think that those are equally difficult discussions to have because not everybody agrees with those positions. And I think that the best defense is making sure that the organization is, keeping their systems patched, having good authentication and identity in place to prevent people from being able to gain access through someone else's credentials, reporting when you do have an issue, at least to government and law enforcement, so that they can try to correlate other data that they may have that could lead them to the attackers. I think the whole free election discussion is just yet the next step from a hacking perspective in terms of how this cyber world can be leveraged to the advantage of any player, whether that player is for profit, for politics, or for hacktivism.
I talked to a Norwegian company, actually, that at the end of the briefing, one of the participants actually said, but they would never do that to us. We were talking about Russia. And I think sometimes there's still a perception of safety that doesn't reflect the reality of the world we're in. And people who might not have been targets 10 years ago are targets now, and they need to adjust to that. Yeah.
What's the old quote? There's no allegiance among enemies. I've got that wrong. But, there's no honor among thieves, right? Mm-hmm. That's the old quote.
That would be true.
Yeah, they wouldn't do that against us yet.
Yeah, that's right. The yet is the word that's often lacking. I think we're coming close to the end here, but we had a couple more questions.
Right. Hi, my name is Elvis Hovor. I work with TrueStar, a security company in San Francisco. So with the understanding that, we know that these black hats often develop a single exploit kit and make, multiple variations of that exploit kit. One, based on that information, I do understand that maybe sharing intel from amongst maybe government, industry is really important, industry to industry, and even sometimes internally within the organization would be able to help stop some of these things. We understand that, shortening the return on investment for the black hats is definitely where, we protect ourselves better.
Yeah.
Do you think we are sharing information enough? That's the first question. And the second question is, will adding anonymity to information sharing make it any better for people to share more?
Sometimes. Are we doing it? Are we doing enough? No. I don't. I personally, that's the business I'm in now. So no, I'd say we're never doing enough sharing information. Finding the right venue to share that information, that's a challenge for everybody. Like, okay, I found this. Who do I tell? So that's always a challenge. I know it makes an impact, and I do believe that by doing it, we are going to make it more expensive for them to do it, to do what they're doing, and that's critical. We shouldn't constantly make it more expensive for us. Let's try and make it more expensive for them.
Yeah, unequivocally, no. There's not enough information sharing. I think there are pockets of it. So, certainly you could go back to, so I've been in this business for 17 years. Back then, even the basic AV companies were sharing samples, right? So there's been sharing of some nature for a very long time. If we look at today, you have things like the financial services industry. There is a consortium within financial services that now share information. Many of the security companies share information with the FBI or other agencies to try to make sure that they've got the information they need to try to thwart this at their level. But in terms of sort of an industry level consortium of intelligence sharing, the difficulty in that is it goes back to profit, right? Companies often see information as a competitive advantage. And I think until we get to a point where the industry, whether that's the security industry or the companies that are a part of the security industry, see intelligence sharing as a requirement to sustaining their business because it enables them to reduce the impact of cyber attacks, it will be difficult to get a very broad scale consortium. I think there's a few things. We've been working on the Cloud Threat Alliance, right? To try to bring together some of the organizations in the security space as this transition to the cloud happens and begin to share information there. So I think there are baby steps, which is promising, but we're not where we need to be by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, I think you're seeing regulators and auditors too, and I've seen it recently, after action reports from, say, your auditors that will come in and go, you're not doing a good enough job of sharing information or joining some type of group or association. I don't see any of that here. Regulators go into the financial institutions and they'll evaluate them on are they playing well with others? Are they taking part or taking advantage of information sharing opportunities? So it's recognized.
And anonymity, it will be critical from a privacy perspective. So if we think about privacy laws, whenever I think privacy laws, I just think Europe as kind of my gold standard because they obviously have been much more prudent in their approach to privacy, I think, than a lot of other areas in the world. They've been leaders in kind of privacy regulation, I guess, depending on how you view that. You can view them as leaders or not. But they've led the charge in privacy. And as you begin to aggregate large amounts of data into a threat intelligence repository that can be shared across industry and government, the whole privacy question comes up. Can you anonymize it enough to protect the privacy of the corporations that are submitting that data and the customers of those corporations that may get kind of drug into that whirlpool?
Yeah.
So I think privacy regulation will be another consideration in that.
Well, as you can tell, the three of us could probably talk for another couple hours. And particularly when you drag up the EU, that's like,
Oh boy.
We could talk for another hour just about them. But we are out of time. So I want to thank you for coming this morning. And please join me in thanking our two speakers.